two of the first landscape architects to graduate from our program in landscape architecture that spring. And from Indiana, Dave acquired a position with a landscape architectural firm in Atlanta, Georgia. And from that position has gone on to a second position with the Department of Natural Resources, State of Georgia, as a park planner. And he will be talking on the park and recreational planning in the state of Georgia. The second speaker, following Mr. Ashley, is Roger Neunschwander, who is a designer with Thompson, Ventilette, and Steinbach Incorporated, also in Atlanta, Georgia. And his project that he has been working on with the firm and is the topic of his discussion this afternoon is Omni International, a total environment for Center City. So I'd like you to welcome Mr. David Ashley, and Roger Neunschwander will follow immediately after Mr. Ashley's talk. Dave? There we go.
Quite a contraption. Thank you, John. Let me offer you some remarks today related to what I think is a slightly different form of leisure than what we've seen so far. I am a site planner and a landscape architect by heart, and I do mostly comprehensive plans, master plans for parks. But I'd like to talk to you today about what I think is the most significant facet of park and recreation planning in the state of Georgia, more specifically called the Heritage Trust Program. I don't know what you've heard about Georgia. This lady here looks like she might be from Georgia. It's true that it's a conservative state, but at the same time, there seems to be a special feel of regionality left in the South, and in Georgia in particular, which is partially responsible, I think, for the creation of a fairly creative and comprehensive planning program for parks and historic sites in the state. I guess the issue that I'm addressing is a form of leisure in which you do not take leisure from your environment, but you react with your environment, and leisure experience comes from within you. Our department is structured around 6 basic divisions. There's a Parks and Historic Sites division, which operates and administers state parks and historic sites. An Earth and Water division, which conducts duties such as geological survey and mapping and mineral exploration. A Game and Fish division, whose major business is wildlife management. A Public Relations division, and a Planning and Research division, of which I am a part. And we work as a liaison between these other divisions, fulfilling their planning needs and acting as a departmental liaison to the state legislature and other governments in legislative matters. The Department of Natural Resources is a fairly new creature. It was created in 1972. It was a reorganization of some 33 independent agencies into one comprehensive unit. The centralized system of governmental administration has resulted in a fairly efficient and comprehensive agency whose major goal is to perpetuate the wise use and preservation of Georgia's resources. Park recreation development and planning has evolved into a fairly comprehensive process, and there are 9 different classifications of lands to which the department addresses itself, including conservation parks, recreation parks, historic sites, wildlife management areas, scenic rivers, trails, wilderness areas, scientific and educational sites, and water access sites. These areas are also not only administered by various departments, but are in literally every corner of the state. And Georgia is the largest state east of the Mississippi. From the Blue Ridge Mountains to the marshes and the beaches along the coast. The vehicle which sort of acts as a catalyst for all these things and pulls them all together under a cohesive framework is the Heritage Trust program. The Heritage Trust was also created, as was a department, in 1972 by an executive order of Governor Jimmy Carter. It was sort of an offshoot of the awakening of environmental awareness in the country as a whole. But suddenly, people began to see that Georgia's most beautiful and best preserved areas were becoming endangered by commercial developments and urban sprawl, consumptive forms of recreational commercial development. And the ironic thing, I guess, about most of these is that they often destroy the very resources they're trying to exploit. Alarm sort of prompted some action, and there was legislation which established the Heritage Trust, and it was charged with establishing a process to identify, acquire, and protect the outstanding resources in the state, whether they be historical, archaeological, natural, or recreational. There was a provision for solicitation of citizen involvement in the nomination and the acquisition of these various sites. And there was the appointment of a 15-member commission to initially study, survey, and prioritize endangered sites in the state for acquisition. As the program has evolved, it's broadened its scope and now includes a system-wide planning approach to the existing and proposed sites in Georgia. The legislature this year established Heritage Trust as a permanent, ongoing program which serves as a catalyst for all acquisition in the department. I have a few slides which I would like to show you related to the heart of the matter itself, which is the resources that are there. Can I get a slide? There we go. The Chattahoochee River flows out of the Blue Ridge Mountains and across the Piedmont Plateau and winds slowly across the coastal plain, but it's different than most of Georgia's rivers because it follows the lineament of a geological fault and travels towards the southwest instead of the southeast into the Atlantic. It ultimately empties into the Gulf of Mexico. The point at which the Chattahoochee cuts through this fault is what you see here, and is an area of rock shoals and sheer bluffs. This area is also about 10 miles from downtown Atlanta and is within half an hour's driving time of about 2 million people. The river corridor itself is mostly land which is very steep, and it remained almost untouched until the late 60s when urban sprawl and various interstate highways threatened to destroy it forever. The state legislature responded and passed a bill limiting development in the Chattahoochee corridor. Acquisition through the Heritage Trust program purchased land for a conservation park on the Chattahoochee. Some of this land, incidentally, was bought at a bargain price of $40,000 an acre. Much of the land in the area is zoned for commercial use and apartment use, 10 units per acre, or office and industrial use. The Chattahoochee is, however, a really unique recreational resource in the major metropolitan area. Its clean water and scenic quality invite exploration. A good summer day, especially a Sunday, may see as many as 3,000 rafters, canoeists, tubers, kayakers out to float the river. It's quite an experience. I'd say the only standard piece of equipment common to everybody is at least one case. If U.S. Congress takes some positive action on a Chattahoochee National Recreation Area bill that's introduced this year, further safeguards will ensure that the Chattahoochee will remain the most beautiful metropolitan river in the country. Outside the old city of Savannah, in the southern part of Georgia, is another of the most outstanding sites in the state. This one extremely rich in history. This is Wormsloe. It's the estate of a Mr. Noble Jones. He was a man who came over with General Oglethorpe and was one of the founding fathers of the state of Georgia. He was given a land grant of some 800 acres by the King George III, and I've read the document, which is sort of a enlightening experience. And he built a tabby dwelling. Tabby is a sort of a concrete-like substance to defend against Spanish invaders from Florida. The estate remained in family hands until the late 60s, when the powers that be decided that the highest and best use of the land was for a subdivision and taxed it accordingly. Property taxes, needless to say, went much too high for the family heirs to retain the property. The Heritage Trust was asked to accept the challenge and did, and in cooperation with the Nature Conservancy, purchased Wormsloe to protect this priceless part of Georgia's past. Farther south along Georgia's coast are two sites of really exceptional charm and beauty. Near the mouth of the Altamaha River lies Louis Island. And Louis Island is a river swamp. That's about the only way to describe it. It's just a very low-lying area in the mouth of the Altamaha, about 5,000 acres, and literally teems with life. It has a personal fascination for me. It's an area that is just abundant in all sorts of wildlife resources. It's the only known virgin cypress stand left in the state of Georgia. And of course, being in South Georgia, it was owned by a paper company. The preservation of the area has been assured, though, and it's also through the Heritage Trust program, which identified this as a very significant site, and acquisition followed. An interesting note is that landowners in the area were persuaded to maintain a logging moratorium until funds could be secured for purchase of the area. The second of these areas along the Altamaha is known as Hovel Plantation, a beautifully preserved rice plantation that dates back to the early 1800s. It's not an ostentatious place, but this complex of house and outbuildings complements Louis Island and gives visitors to the area a special perspective of life on a coastal plain in early Georgia. While the coastal planters were busy planting rice and indigo, the early industrialists began moving up the broad coastal rivers of the state in search of water power from mills and factories. The fall line, where the rivers drop from the Piedmont Plateau to the coastal plain, became a series of industrialized nodes along every river in the state, around which the cities of Columbus, Macon, and Augusta sprang up. This part of Georgia history is combined with a lineal riverfront park in the Augusta Canal State Park. Historic buildings such as this building, which was once used to manufacture Confederate uniforms, tell the story of this part of Georgia history and indeed the story of the history of Southern industrial development. Another historic feature of this park is the location of the Mackay House. Augusta is a very old city dating back to the Revolution. The top balcony there is an area where 13 of our guys, patriots, were hanged. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of success with the revolution in Georgia. Several other historic structures exist along the canal and seem to be in daily use even now. It's not known whether they're revolutionary or not. Along the coast, there is a revolutionary fort, a bona fide revolutionary fort, near the small town of Sunbury. Fort Morris, majestic live oaks and earth mounds are all that remain, but the quiet solitude of this area, which is just in nowhere, was recently threatened by the attraction of marshfront real estate, and it was subdivided into lots. Heritage Trust stepped in once again and has now preserved this area for development as a historic site. Not all the Heritage Trust effort has gone into acquiring new sites. Existing parks like Amicalola Falls, which is located on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, have been studied and recommendations have been made for improving the visitor experience and protecting the parks from residential or commercial development. At Amicalola Falls, it was necessary for the Heritage Trust program to acquire buffer lands to sort of close up the park boundaries with National Forest Service lands. There's some debate in our office as to whether the falls are nicer when you look at them from the bottom or from the top. While not officially a Heritage Trust responsibility, staff in the Department of Natural Resources has assisted greatly from a state government point of view in adding nearly 400,000 acres of wilderness, legal wilderness, to the federal government's wilderness areas in Georgia. These include the corridor of the Chattahoochee River, which is what you see here, scene of the filming of Deliverance, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Okefenokee Swamp, Cumberland Island, which is the state assisted here in developing this area as a national seashore, although it will not be operated by the state per se. These are only a few of Georgia's finest and best preserved places. Many more have been considered and await funding for acquisition at this time. However, this firm initial commitment is a clear demonstration, I think, that Georgia cares about preserving its heritage through the Heritage Trust program. Thank you.